dying on the dark streets of Flint. In the summer of 2010, a terrifying predator stalked the streets of America's Midwest. His name was Elias Abuelazam, but the press would soon give him another title, the Flint Serial Stabber. Over the course of just 3 months, this seemingly ordinary man would unleash a wave of violence that left 5 people dead and at least 13 others wounded across 3 states, Michigan, Ohio, and Virginia. His method was as simple as it was devastating. Approach strangers, ask for help, and then plunge a knife into their unsuspecting bodies before disappearing into the night. This is the complete story of one of America's most unusual serial killers. From his troubled beginnings in Israel to the bloody summer that terrorized the nation, and finally to the courtroom where justice would be served. We will examine not just what happened, but why it happened, delving into the mind of a killer whose motives remain disturbingly unclear even years after his conviction. Normal on the outside, cold within. Early life and background. Elias Abuelazam was born on August 29, 1976, in the city of Ramla, Israel. Born into a well-to-do Arab Christian family, his early life was marked by tragedy when his father died of illness when Abuelazam was still an infant. Following this loss, he was raised primarily by his mother and 4 sisters in a modest 2-story stone home in a Christian section of Ramla's historic old city. The family owned a grocery store and 2 other shops in town, and his mother was generally well regarded in the community. At some point during his childhood, Abuelazam moved to the United States with his family after his mother remarried. This transition between cultures would become a recurring pattern in his life, as he would move back and forth between Israel and America multiple times over the years. According to the U.S. State Department, he officially changed his last name to Abuelazam in March 1995, though he would continue to be known by both spellings throughout his life. Physical appearance and demeanor. Physically, Abuelazam was an imposing figure, standing 6 feet 5 inches tall, 1.96 meters, and weighing approximately 280 pounds, 130 kilograms. His size alone made him intimidating, described by one former co-worker as a gentle giant, a characterization that would prove tragically ironic, given the violence he would later unleash. Despite his imposing stature, those who knew him described Abuelazam as generally quiet and reserved. He was not known to be particularly outgoing or social, and there were few indications of the violence that would later define him. His mother would later describe him as a religious, God-fearing man who always assists anyone who needs help, a statement that stands in stark contrast to his subsequent actions. Education and work history. Details about Abuelazam's formal education remain sparse in public records. What is known is that he spent approximately half his life in the United States, holding a green card that allowed him legal residency, though he never obtained U.S. citizenship. His employment history reveals a man who drifted between various jobs, never establishing a long-term career. Most notably, from an unknown date until 2008, Abuelazam worked at Piedmont Behavioral Health Center, LLC, later renamed North Spring Behavioral Healthcare, in Leesburg, Virginia, where he was employed as a mental health technician. The irony of his employment at a psychiatric facility would not be lost on those who later evaluated his own mental state during his trial. By the summer of 2010, Abuelazam had settled in Flint, Michigan, where he lived with his uncle and worked as a clerk at the Kingwater Market in the Beecher area from July 5th to August 1st, 2010. He earned $10 per hour working the afternoon shift, typically from 3 p.m. to 2 a.m. This seemingly mundane existence gave no outward indication of the violence that was about to erupt. Personal life and relationships. Abuelazam's personal life was marked by instability and failed relationships. He was married twice, first to Dawn Costello in 1997, a marriage that ended in divorce, and then to Jessica Hirth on July 30th, 2004, a union that also ended in divorce in 2007. These failed marriages hint at possible difficulties in maintaining close personal relationships, though specific details about the causes of these divorces remain largely private. By the time of his crimes in 2010, Abuelazam was living with his uncle in a house on Maryland Avenue in Flint, Michigan. His uncle, Tony Sawani, would later testify that it didn't strike his mind that his nephew might be involved in the stabbings that were terrorizing the community. Despite Abuelazam's suspicious behavior and late-night absences, early warning signs. While Abuelazam had no significant criminal record prior to his stabbing spree, there were some troubling incidents in his past that, in retrospect, might have served as warning signs. In 1997, at the age of 21, he attempted suicide by stabbing himself in the neck, an early indication of possible mental health issues and a disturbing foreshadowing of the violence to come. More directly concerning was an incident that occurred approximately 6 months before his stabbing spree began. During a visit to his family in Ramla, Israel, Abuelazam allegedly stabbed a friend in the face with a screwdriver. Israeli police investigated the incident, but dropped the case when the victim refused to press charges. This attack, had it been properly addressed, might have been the first documented instance of Abuelazam's violent tendencies. Additionally, Leesburg police later revealed that Abuelazam was a suspect in an unsolved homicide from March 2009, the murder of his neighbor, Jamie Lane, who was 44 years old at the time. In 2017, 7 years after his conviction for the Flint murders, Abuelazam would finally confess to killing Lane, bringing closure to at least one cold case connected to his violent history. Trail of blood. The attack pattern from Michigan to Virginia. The method of attack. Beginning in May 2010, Abuelazam embarked on what would become one of the most terrifying serial stabbing sprees in recent American history. His method of attack was consistent, calculated, and chillingly effective. Typically, Abuelazam would drive around late at night in his green Chevrolet Trailblazer SUV, searching for potential victims. He specifically targeted individuals who were walking alone, usually in the early morning hours when few witnesses would be present. Most of his victims were described as small-framed men, short, thin, or non-muscular, creating a stark physical contrast with his own imposing size. Once he spotted a suitable target, Abuelazam would approach them under the pretense of needing assistance. He would either ask for directions or claim to be having car trouble, requesting help with his vehicle. When the unsuspecting victim would stop to offer assistance, Abuelazam would suddenly attack, stabbing them quickly and forcefully, usually in the chest or stomach. The attacks were brutally efficient. Abuelazam would typically stab his victims once or twice before immediately fleeing the scene. He rarely spoke during the attacks, and the entire encounter would often last less than a minute. This quick strike approach allowed him to disappear before help could arrive, leaving his victims bleeding on the street. The victims and timeline. The first documented attack in the series occurred on May 24, 2010 in Flint, Michigan. From that date until August 2010, Abuelazam would strike repeatedly, with the frequency of attacks increasing as the summer progressed. By the time of his arrest, authorities had linked Abuelazam to at least 18 stabbing attacks across 3 states, with 14 occurring in and around Flint, Michigan, 3 in Leesburg, Virginia, and 1 in Toledo, Ohio. 5 of these attacks proved fatal, while the remaining victims suffered serious, often life-threatening injuries. The victims shared several common characteristics that suggest a pattern to Abuelazam's target selection. The vast majority were African-American men, raising questions about possible racial motivation behind the attacks. Most were attacked while walking alone at night in urban areas, suggesting that Abuelazam deliberately sought out vulnerable individuals who would have difficulty defending themselves against his much larger physical frame. Notable cases. Among the most well-documented attacks was the murder of Arnold Miner, a 49-year-old handyman who was stabbed after midnight near downtown Flint on August 2, 2010. Miner's case would eventually become the centerpiece of the prosecution against Abuelazam, as investigators found Miner's blood both in Abuelazam's SUV and on clothing packed in his luggage. Miner's family members would later attend Abuelazam's trial, carrying a box containing Miner's cremated remains, a poignant reminder of the human cost of Abuelazam's violence. Another notable victim was Darwin Marshall, 43, who was stabbed to death on July 26, 2010 in Flint. A witness claimed she observed Abuelazam's SUV and then saw Marshall stabbed on the ground on Garland Street near 5th Avenue. The witness, Shamari Williams, provided emotional testimony during the trial, recalling how Marshall was shaking, coughing up all kinds of blood after the attack. Frank Kellybrew, 60, was another victim, whose murder was directly linked to Abuelazam. Kellybrew was discovered dead near a restaurant dumpster on July 30th, 2010. Investigators found a trail of blood near his body, along with a bag of snacks bought around 3:20 a.m. by Kellybrew from a nearby store. Blood found on Abuelazam's shoelaces would later be matched to Kellybrew's DNA, providing crucial evidence linking him to this murder. 17-year-old Etwan Wilson survived his encounter with Abuelazam on August 1st, 2010. Wilson recounted how a large man approached him and asked for directions in the early morning hours. "I turned away from him and he started attacking," Wilson would later testify, showing the court the large scar running down his chest from the attack. Antwine Marshall, 26, was another survivor who provided crucial testimony. Marshall described how Abuelazam approached him on July 27, 2010, asking for help fixing his car. When Marshall opened the hood of the vehicle, Abuelazam stabbed him twice. The attack left Marshall with 3 damaged organs and a long scar from his chest to his pelvic area. During his testimony, Marshall recalled the moment of the attack. "I said, 'This ain't gonna get popped tonight.' When I said that, that's when he got to stabbing me." Geographic spread. While the majority of Abuelazam's attacks occurred in Flint, Michigan, the geographic spread of his crimes complicated the investigation and initially prevented authorities from connecting the incidents. The attacks in Leesburg, Virginia occurred in an area where Abuelazam had previously lived and worked, suggesting a comfort with the location that might have facilitated his crimes there. The single attack in Toledo, Ohio, appeared to be opportunistic, occurring as Abuelazam traveled between Michigan and Virginia. This multi-state pattern of violence eventually necessitated a coordinated response from law enforcement agencies across jurisdictions, including local police departments, state authorities, and ultimately, the FBI. Psychological impact on survivors. For those who survived Abuelazam's attacks, the physical wounds were just the beginning of their ordeal. Many faced lengthy hospitalizations and difficult recoveries from their injuries. Tom Booker, who was stabbed while walking to a store on July 19, 2010, spent 3 weeks in the hospital after the attack. During his testimony, he described the lasting impact. "My body hurts. It's hard to get back in shape, just a horrible thing." Beyond the physical trauma, survivors also dealt with significant psychological effects. Many experienced symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, including flashbacks, anxiety, and a persistent fear of being attacked again. The seemingly random nature of the attacks left survivors questioning why they had been targeted, adding another layer of psychological distress to their recovery process. For the communities affected by Abuelazam's crimes, particularly the African American community in Flint, the attacks created a climate of fear and suspicion. People altered their daily routines, avoided walking alone at night, and some even carried makeshift weapons for protection. The racial pattern of the attacks added an additional dimension of fear, as many wondered if they might be targeted simply because of the color of their skin. The manhunt, a race against time. Formation of the task force. As the number of stabbings increased throughout the summer of 2010, law enforcement officials began to recognize that they were dealing with a serial attacker. On August 4, 2010, authorities in Genesee County, Michigan, officially announced that the series of stabbings dating back to May were the work of one individual. This public acknowledgement led to the formation of a multi-jurisdictional task force dedicated to identifying and apprehending the perpetrator. The task force brought together resources from multiple agencies, including the Flint Police Department, the Genesee County Sheriff's Office, Michigan State Police, and eventually the FBI. This collaborative approach was necessary, given the geographic spread of the crimes and the increasing public pressure to stop the violence. We realized we had to find this guy. The people on the task force worked around the clock, recalled Genesee County Prosecutor David Layton. The task force established a hotline for tips from the public and began the painstaking process of analyzing evidence from the various crime scenes, looking for connections that might lead them to the killer. Key breaks in the case. The investigation gained momentum when authorities released a composite sketch of the suspect based on descriptions provided by surviving victims. While the sketch would later be criticized for its limited resemblance to Abuelazam, it helped generate public awareness about the case and encourage people to come forward with information. A crucial breakthrough came when investigators identified a pattern in the suspect's vehicle. Multiple victims and witnesses described seeing a green or dark-colored SUV, specifically a Chevrolet Blazer or similar model, near the scenes of the attacks. Surveillance footage from a market near one of the crime scenes captured a suspicious vehicle matching this description speeding away around the time of an attack. The most significant tip came from an anonymous caller who contacted the police hotline with information about a man who worked at a party store in Beecher, Michigan, and had ties to Virginia. The caller identified the suspect as Elijah and noted that he had not returned to work since the stabbing of a 49-year-old man, Arnold Miner, at the beginning of August. Following up on this lead, FBI investigators and Michigan police officers raided the store on Wednesday, August 11th, and reviewed surveillance tapes of the employee, who had worked there every day from 3 p.m. to 2 a.m. since July 5. The store's manager, Abdullah Farah, informed investigators that the worker's name was Elias, not Elijah, and that he had recently said he was going to visit his sister in Virginia. The arrest. As investigators closed in on their suspect, they made a critical discovery. Elias Abuelazam had purchased a ticket to Tel Aviv, Israel, and was planning to leave the country that very night. His uncle had purchased a one-way ticket for him, raising further suspicions about his sudden departure. Acting quickly, authorities coordinated with officials at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, where Abuelazam was scheduled to board Delta Airlines Flight 152 to Tel Aviv. On the evening of August 11, 2010, as Abuelazam waited at the boarding gate, airport security paged him over the intercom. Passengers who were on the same flight later described how Abuelazam appeared tense and was talking on his cell phone when 6 police officers approached and arrested him without incident. He was talking on the phone. I didn't hear what he said, recalled Romy Shaked, a passenger on the plane. I just saw him talking to different people and moving around and sitting in different seats. The arrest came just moments before Abuelazam would have boarded the plane and potentially escaped U.S. jurisdiction. It was a dramatic conclusion to a manhunt that had intensified over the preceding weeks as the attacks continued and public fear mounted. Evidence collection. Following Abuelazam's arrest, investigators began the process of collecting and analyzing evidence that would link him to the series of stabbings. A search of his luggage revealed crucial physical evidence, including clothing with bloodstains that would later be matched to victims through DNA analysis. Particularly damning was the discovery of Arnold Miner's blood, both on Abuelazam's shoes and inside his vehicle. Additionally, a shoelace stained with Frank Kellebrew's blood was found in a bag belonging to Abuelazam. These physical connections provided investigators with concrete evidence, linking Abuelazam directly to specific victims. Technological evidence also played a role in building the case against Abuelazam. A Michigan State Police trooper testified that Abuelazam's phone position, tracked through cell tower data, correlated with the area where Arnold Miner was stabbed, as well as the locations of other attacks. This digital footprint helped establish Abuelazam's presence at or near multiple crime scenes. Prior police encounters. In a troubling revelation that emerged after his arrest, it became clear that Abuelazam had been stopped by police at least twice during his stabbing spree, but had been released each time. On July 29, 2010, the same day as an early morning attack now attributed to him, Abuelazam was cited in Genesee County, Michigan for providing alcohol to a minor. He was scheduled to appear in court on August 4th for this charge, but failed to show up. Even more concerning was an incident that occurred just days before his arrest, when Abuelazam was picked up in Arlington, Virginia, for failing to stop at a stop sign. During the routine traffic stop, police discovered he had an outstanding warrant for misdemeanor assault. Despite this, he was released after being booked and processed. In both instances, authorities failed to connect him to the ongoing stabbing investigations, allowing him to continue his violent spree. These missed opportunities highlight the challenges faced by law enforcement when dealing with a suspect who crosses jurisdictional boundaries and whose crimes initially appear unrelated. It was only through the coordinated efforts of the multi-agency task force that the connections were finally made, leading to Abuelazam's arrest before he could flee the country.
The trial. Truth behind the demon's face.
Extradition and initial proceedings. Following his arrest in Atlanta on August 11, 2010, Abuelazam appeared in a Georgia courtroom where he was given the option to fight extradition to Michigan. After some deliberation, he chose to waive his right to fight extradition, telling the judge, "I will fight the case in Michigan. Why should I wait 90 days, right? That's the most common sense. It sounds more logical to me to go now than to wait 3 months." On August 26, 2010, Abuelazam was flown to Flint and lodged in the Genesee County Jail, where he was held in solitary confinement. Sheriff Robert Pickle explained that this isolation was likely for Abuelazam's own safety and because he had scarred a lot of lives with his actions. At his arraignment, the judge ordered him held without bond, even after the prosecutor had asked for $10 million bail, indicating the severity of the charges and the perceived threat he posed to the community. The charges. The legal case against Abuelazam was complex, involving multiple charges across several jurisdictions. In Genesee County, Michigan alone, he faced 3 murder charges and 6 counts of assault with intent to murder. Additionally, he was charged with felonious assault in Toledo, Ohio, for the stabbing of church janitor Tony Leno. The first formal charge came on August 26, 2010, when the Genesee County Prosecutor's Office charged him with 1 count of assault with intent to commit murder for the attack on Antoine Marshall on July 27, 2010. Over the following months, additional charges were filed as investigators connected Abuelazam to more of the attacks. On October 21, 2010, he was charged with murder in the stabbing deaths of Frank Kellybrew and Darwin Marshall. Later, on November 4, 2010, he faced additional charges of resisting and obstructing police officers after an incident in which he attempted to punch a deputy and had to be tasered with the help of 4 other officers. Further charges of malicious destruction of property were added on November 12, 2010, for smashing the windows of a car belonging to the boyfriend of a witness.
The insanity defense.
As the case moved toward trial, Abuelazam's defense team, led by attorneys Brian Morley and Edouard Zainé, began to develop their strategy. They chose to pursue an insanity defense, arguing that Abuelazam suffered from paranoid schizophrenia and was not criminally responsible for his actions. The first trial, focusing on the murder of Arnold Miner, began on May 8, 2012. During the 8-day proceedings, the defense called psychiatrist Dr. Norman Miller, who testified that Abuelazam was a paranoid schizophrenic who experienced bizarre delusions and believed that evil forces directed him to harm others. Dr. Miller told the court, because of major mental illness, paranoid schizophrenia, he did it. These evil forces just expressed themselves through Mr. Abuelazam. There wasn't any question about whether what he was doing was right or wrong. The psychiatrist also cited Abuelazam's 1997 suicide attempt and a 2009 diagnosis by an Israeli psychologist who had described him as psychotic following the stabbing of a friend. Miller further argued that Abuelazam's pattern of attack, stabbing victims once or twice and then leaving, indicated that his intent was not to kill. The delusions, not Mr. Abuelazam, would want to hurt them. His intent was not to kill anyone. He would stab them once or twice and then leave. He would not stay to finish them off. The prosecution's case. In response to the insanity defense, prosecutors presented a strong case based on both physical evidence and expert testimony. The physical evidence was compelling. Arnold Miner's blood was found on the steering wheel of Abuelazam's SUV and on pants and shoes inside his luggage as he attempted to flee to Israel. This direct DNA connection provided a concrete link between Abuelazam and the murder. To counter the defense's mental illness claims, prosecutors called 3 mental health experts who had interviewed Abuelazam and determined he was not mentally ill or incapable of understanding his criminal acts. These experts pointed to several factors that suggested Abuelazam was fully aware of what he was doing. The planning that went into the attacks, which occurred in the early morning hours with no witnesses around, his consistent pattern of targeting vulnerable victims, his attempts to evade capture, including his planned flight to Israel, his unusual lack of empathy for the victims, even months after the attacks. As one state psychiatrist explained, he appreciated that what he was doing was wrong. He went on dark roads, picked out victims, had weapons available to him, left the scene of his behavior, actually tried to leave the country, and but for luck and good police work would have been in Israel. So he knew that his behavior was wrong. In a particularly powerful move, the judge allowed 4 other stabbing victims to show their wounds to the jury and identify Abuelazam as the man responsible for their injuries. This testimony from multiple survivors created a pattern of evidence that was difficult for the defense to overcome. Victim testimony. The testimony of surviving victims and witnesses provided some of the most compelling moments of the trial. Each survivor recounted their encounter with Abuelazam, describing how a seemingly innocent request for help quickly turned violent. Tom Booker testified, "He tried to kill me. He stuck a knife in my liver." Etwan Wilson showed the court his scars and positively identified Abuelazam in the courtroom, stating simply, "Abuelazam. He's wearing that orange jumpsuit." Perhaps the most emotional testimony came from Shamari Williams, who witnessed the murder of Darwin Marshall. Through tears, she described seeing Marshall after the attack. "When I looked up on the ground, he was shaking, coughing up all kinds of blood." Family members of the victims also made their presence felt in the courtroom. During the trial, Arnold Miner's family members held a box containing his cremated ashes while listening to the evidence against Abuelazam. This poignant reminder of the human cost of Abuelazam's actions had a powerful impact on everyone in the courtroom, including the jury. The verdict and sentencing. After 8 days of testimony and evidence presentation, the case went to the jury on May 22, 2012. Despite the complexity of the insanity defense, the jury deliberated for just a few hours before returning with their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Arnold Miner. The jury had rejected the insanity defense, finding that Abuelazam was criminally responsible for his actions. Jury foreman Will Ogle later explained that the defense's arguments about mental illness didn't align with the evidence. The demons only come out at 3 o'clock in the morning when no one's looking. That doesn't add up. He described the verdict as very easy, concluding simply, "He's one evil dude." On June 25, 2012, Abuelazam was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, the mandatory sentence for first-degree murder in Michigan. During the sentencing hearing, Miner's mother, Elzora Miner, collapsed in tears and had to be carried from the courtroom. His sister, Stephanie Ward, expressed her feelings more bluntly, saying she wanted Abuelazam to rot in hell. Abuelazam himself chose not to make a statement in court or to the victim's family, maintaining the same silence that had characterized much of his behavior throughout the proceedings. Aftermath of the trial. Following Abuelazam's conviction in the Arnold Miner case, prosecutors made the decision not to pursue trials for the other attacks in Michigan unless his first murder conviction was overturned on appeal. Genesee County Prosecutor David Layton explained that since Abuelazam was already serving life without parole, the maximum sentence possible in Michigan, additional convictions would not add to his punishment. Similarly, authorities in Toledo, Ohio, and Leesburg, Virginia, opted not to pursue charges against Abuelazam for the attacks in their jurisdictions. This decision was based partly on practical considerations: the expense and complexity of transporting a convicted murderer across state lines for trial, and partly on the fact that no additional punishment could be imposed beyond the life sentence he was already serving. For some victims and their families, this decision was frustrating, as it meant they would not have their day in court or see Abuelazam formally held accountable for the attacks against them. However, the conviction in the minor case did provide a measure of justice and ensured that Abuelazam would never again be free to harm others.
Criminal psychology. Analyzing the mind of a killer. Possible motives. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Abuelazam case is the apparent lack of a clear motive for his crimes. Unlike many serial killers who are driven by sexual impulses, financial gain, or specific grievances, Abuelazam's attacks seem to lack any obvious purpose beyond the violence itself. The racial pattern of his victim selection, with the vast majority being African-American men, raise questions about possible racial motivation. Police in Leesburg, Virginia, where the population is predominantly white, suspected the attacks may have been racially motivated. However, Genesee County prosecutors declined to speculate on this motive, noting that the population of Flint is mostly black, which could explain the demographic pattern of victims there. Jack Levin, a criminologist at Northeastern University in Boston, suggested that hate may have been a driving factor. Whether it was directed at Americans in general or black Americans, I do think the spree was motivated by hate. However, he also noted a complicating factor. The complicating factor here is that the defendant is not an American citizen. There is little doubt that he would have fit the category of a hate-motivated killer, someone who targeted black Americans out of racial animosity. But the fact that he was from Middle East also raises the possibility that he hated Americans. Another possibility is that Abuelazam's actions were driven by mental illness, as his defense team argued during the trial. The claim that he heard voices or was compelled by evil forces suggests a potential psychotic disorder. However, the prosecution's experts found no evidence of schizophrenia or other severe mental illness, and the jury ultimately rejected this explanation. Psychological profile. From a psychological perspective, Abuelazam's behavior exhibits several characteristics commonly associated with psychopathy or antisocial personality disorder. These include lack of empathy for his victims, even months after the attacks, calculated, predatory behavior in selecting vulnerable targets, ability to maintain a normal facade in daily life while committing extreme violence, absence of remorse or guilt for his actions. Criminologists noted that Abuelazam's case was somewhat unusual in the world of serial killers. Jack Levin observed that Abuelazam might represent a hybrid criminal type, someone who is motivated by the grievances of a mass killer but uses the tactics of a serial killer. This combination made his behavior particularly difficult to categorize within traditional frameworks of criminal psychology. The FBI's analysis of the case suggested that Abuelazam deliberately chose easy targets, people who were walking alone, often in vulnerable situations, and who might have slower reaction times due to the late hour or other factors. This strategic selection of victims indicates a level of planning and predatory behavior consistent with organized serial offenders rather than impulsive attackers. Pattern analysis. The consistency of Abuelazam's attack method suggests a ritualistic aspect to his crimes that is common among serial offenders. His approach followed a clear pattern. Driving around late at night in his SUV, searching for suitable victims, targeting primarily small-framed men walking alone, using a ruse, asking for directions or help with his car to approach victims, attacking suddenly with a knife, typically stabbing once or twice in the chest or abdomen, fleeing immediately after the attack without taking anything from the victims. This methodical approach, combined with the increasing frequency of attacks over time, follows a pattern often seen in serial offenders who become more confident and compulsive as their crimes continue without detection. The escalation in the number of attacks during the summer of 2010 suggests that Abuelazam was becoming more driven by his compulsion to stab as time went on. Comparison to other serial killers. While Abuelazam shares some characteristics with other serial killers, his case has several distinctive features that set it apart from more typical patterns. Unlike many serial killers who target specific types of victims for sexual gratification, Abuelazam's attacks appeared to be motivated primarily by the act of violence itself. His method of approaching strangers and asking for help before attacking bears some similarity to the tactics used by Ted Bundy, who often feigned injury or disability to lure victims. However, unlike Bundy, Abuelazam did not kidnap his victims or subject them to prolonged torture. His attacks were brief and immediate. The racial pattern of his victim selection has parallels with hate-motivated killers like Joseph Paul Franklin, who targeted interracial couples and black individuals in the late 1970s and early 1980s. However, Abuelazam's background as an Arab immigrant from Israel adds complexity to any straightforward racial motivation theory. Perhaps the most unusual aspect of Abuelazam's case is the short time frame and high frequency of his attacks. Most serial killers operate over periods of years, with cooling-off periods between murders. Abuelazam's concentrated spree of 18 attacks in just 3 months represents an unusually accelerated pattern that more closely resembles a spree killer than a traditional serial murder. Impact and legacy: the aftermath of terror. Community response. The summer of 2010 was a period of intense fear and anxiety for the communities affected by Abuelazam's attacks, particularly in Flint, Michigan. As news spread about the serial stabber, residents altered their behaviors and took extraordinary precautions to protect themselves. For 10 days during the summer of 2010, Flint residents walked the night in fear, reported one local news outlet. Some carried fallen tree limbs to use as clubs for protection. Others toted bats, blades, or other weapons. The atmosphere of terror was palpable, with many people avoiding going out after dark entirely. The racial pattern of the attacks created additional tension and fear within the African American community, as most of the victims were black men. This raised concerns about possible hate crimes and led to increased vigilance among minority residents. Local businesses also felt the impact, as fewer people ventured out at night, and those who did were less likely to walk alone or use public transportation. The economic effect on an already struggling city like Flint was yet another consequence of Abuelazam's reign of terror. Media coverage and public reaction. The case received extensive media coverage, both locally and nationally. Michigan media outlets dubbed Abuelazam the Flint Serial Slasher or the Flint Serial Stabber, names that heightened public awareness but also intensified fear. As the number of attacks grew and spread across state lines, national news organizations began covering the story, bringing attention to the manhunt and the communities living in fear. The dramatic arrest at Atlanta's airport, as Abuelazam attempted to flee the country, created headlines across America and internationally, particularly in Israel. Public reaction to the case was a mixture of fear, outrage, and relief when Abuelazam was finally apprehended. The seemingly random nature of the attacks, striking ordinary people doing ordinary things like walking home or going to a store, touched a nerve with the public, highlighting the vulnerability that anyone could feel in such circumstances. Impact on victims and families. For the survivors of Abuelazam's attacks and the families of those who were killed, the impact has been profound and lasting. Physical recovery from the stab wounds was often lengthy and difficult, with some victims requiring extensive medical treatment and rehabilitation. Tom Booker, who spent 3 weeks in the hospital after being stabbed, expressed the ongoing physical challenges. "My body hurts. It's hard to get back in shape. Just a horrible thing." Antoine Marshall was left with a long scar from his chest to his pelvic area and damage to 3 internal organs. The psychological trauma has been equally severe and more enduring. Many survivors continue to experience symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, including flashbacks, anxiety, and hypervigilance. The random nature of the attacks has made it particularly difficult for victims to process their experiences, as there was no personal connection or explanation for why they were targeted. For the families of those killed, the grief has been compounded by the senselessness of the crimes. At Abuelazam's sentencing, the raw emotion was evident when Arnold Miner's mother collapsed in tears and had to be carried from the courtroom. His sister's wish for Abuelazam to rot in hell reflected the anger and pain felt by many of the victims' loved ones. Legal system reflections. The Abuelazam case raised several important questions about the legal system's handling of mental illness defenses and cross-jurisdictional crimes. The insanity defense, which is notoriously difficult to prove in Michigan, highlighted the challenges of determining criminal responsibility in cases involving claims of mental illness. As attorney Robert Ashley noted, "Jurors are common-sense people. You can convince them with proper testimony that someone might be mentally ill, but you still have a dead body. They want someone to have responsibility for that." This tension between acknowledging potential mental health issues and holding individuals accountable for violent crimes remains a complex area of criminal justice. The decision not to prosecute Abuelazam for all of his alleged crimes also sparked debate about how the legal system handles cases involving multiple victims across different jurisdictions. While practical considerations made this approach understandable, he was already serving the maximum possible sentence. Some victims and their families felt denied the closure that might have come from seeing justice served in their specific cases. In 2017, this issue was partially addressed when Abuelazam confessed to the 2009 murder of Jamie Lane in Leesburg, Virginia. Although he was granted immunity for this confession and was not charged with the crime, the admission provided some closure for Lane's family. As Lane's widow, Della Allen, expressed, "It feels so good to have closure and not be in fear like I have for the past 8 years. I'm at peace, and I'm sure he is too."
Abuelazam.
Today, Elias Abuelazam remains incarcerated in the Michigan prison system, serving his life sentence without the possibility of parole. According to prison records, he has continued to exhibit violent behavior behind bars, with reports of attacks on fellow inmates and possession of weapons. These incidents have only reinforced the decision to keep him permanently separated from society. In May 2017, 7 years after his conviction, Abuelazam made headlines again when he confessed to the 2009 murder of Jamie Lane in Leesburg, Virginia. This confession came as part of an agreement with Loudoun County prosecutors, who granted him immunity in exchange for providing closure to Lane's family. This development added another confirmed victim to Abuelazam's toll and provided answers to a cold case that had remained unsolved for 8 years. Beyond this confession, Abuelazam has maintained a relatively low profile in prison. He has not given interviews or made public statements about his crimes, leaving many questions about his motives and thought processes unanswered. For the communities and individuals affected by his violence, this silence may be yet another form of cruelty, denying them the understanding or explanation they might seek for such senseless attack. Conclusion. The case of Elias Abuelazam stands as one of the most disturbing examples of seemingly random violence in recent American history. Over the course of just 3 months, in the summer of 2010, this outwardly ordinary man transformed into a predator who spread terror across 3 states, leaving 5 people dead and at least 13 others wounded. What makes Abuelazam's case particularly chilling is the contrast between his mundane daily life, working at a liquor store, living with his uncle, and the extreme violence he unleashed during his nighttime hunts. This duality highlights the unsettling reality that sometimes the most dangerous individuals can appear completely normal on the surface. The racial pattern of his victim selection remains one of the most troubling aspects of the case, raising questions about hate and prejudice that have never been fully answered. Whether motivated by racial animus, mental illness, or some other dark impulse, Abuelazam's actions remind us of the vulnerability we all share and the random nature of some violence. For the survivors and the families of those killed, the impact of Abuelazam's crimes continues long after his conviction. Physical scars may heal, but the psychological trauma of such senseless attacks can last a lifetime. Their courage in facing their attacker in court and sharing their stories has been an essential part of achieving justice and beginning the healing process. While Abuelazam will spend the rest of his life in prison, the questions surrounding his motives and the forces that drove him to violence may never be fully answered. In the absence of clear explanations, his case serves as a sobering reminder of the darkness that can exist within the human psyche and the devastating consequences when that darkness is unleashed upon the world.